What's up guys, this is Sage from truEFFECT Supplements, and today we're going to be reacting to HMB increases muscle more than steroids and 8% decrease in fat. And this is by Thomas DeLauer, and I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I highly recommend you go check out his channel. He's got a ton of knowledge on the exercise and fitness space, and specifically regarding bodybuilding in a lot of cases. Has great resources on supplements in those spaces as well. And the link will be in the description, so just go check them out, show them some love, and let's get right into it.
What is HMB first? So HMB stands for beta hydroxy beta methylbutyrate. Okay? It is a byproduct of breaking down leucine. Leucine is the primary amino acid that is associated with building muscle, okay, muscle recovery. When we consume protein, we break the proteins down, we deaminate them, and leucine is the one amino acid that is really responsible for triggering the anabolic response. It's the most anabolic amino acid that there is.
So the big thing that I want to highlight here is the fact that when we think about leucine, we want to focus really on the muscle growth aspect rather than overall muscle growth and recovery, because ultimately studies have shown that despite the fact that leucine has been marketed as as beneficial in terms of muscle recovery, you know, getting you back into the gym quicker, making you feel better after your workouts, this has been disproven in multiple studies. And so, and actually for pre-workout, like taking it before workout, it can actually reduce the amount of energy output and therefore reduce performance. And so avoid taking leucine pre-workout. Taking leucine after workout, remember that it's only for increasing muscle growth. I still recommend taking it, just I want to note specifically that that's what it does. That's what its intended use is. All right.
Okay, now since HMB is sort of a downstream, like sort of metabolite, it's like a broken down component of leucine, the argument is, okay, I'm essentially getting a highly concentrated component of leucine that could trigger more muscle growth and potentially more strength and possibly even more fat loss if we look at enough data. Makes some sense, right? Okay, if you look at gram for gram, to get a 3-gram serving of HMB, you would have to consume 600 grams of protein, which would get you about 60 grams of leucine, which would equate to about 3 grams of HMB. So very, in essence, like people are looking at it as like a concentrated, super finite concentrated form of protein that is having a direct effect on muscle tissue.
That's really oversimplified. It goes without saying. But I think a really important thing to note here is the recommended daily dosage. Recommended daily dosage, he didn't really outline it there. It's 1 to 3 grams of HMB. He might outline it later, but I just wanted to note that for you guys right now.
Now, leucine goes through a number of different conversion enzymatic processes, right? Okay, we have keto isocaproate oxygenase, which breaks it down a little bit more into KIC, and then that gets broken down into HMB and some other compounds, most of which are excreted, and you're only left with a small amount of HMB, which hence why you have such a concentrated amount, right? You don't get much out of your protein, but you don't seem to need much to do the job.
Well, the fact that you don't need much to get the job done is, I think, kind of like negligible, because ultimately that means that since it's found in such low amounts in protein, it means you should probably be supplementing it if you want to completely separately. So ultimately, if you're taking like 20 grams of leucine, you'd be getting the minimum dosage of HMB. So nobody's taking 20 grams of leucine on its own, right? So therefore, I think it's important, if you're going to be supplementing HMB, make sure you take it separately.
So now that we know roughly what it is and why people take it, let's move into the 2 different common forms. Okay, there is HMB calcium, HMB-CA, which you'll see, and there's also HMB-FA, free acid form. Now, they're both fine, okay, and the calcium form, like when you ingest it, it's going to get disassociated in the gut and it's going to absorb relatively quick in like 10 to 15 minutes. It's going to be in your system anyway. But most of the data is suggesting that a free acid form could have between 91 and 97% more availability. So it's going to absorb that much better. But at the end of the day, they're both pretty darn good. You're just getting better utilization, possibly out of a free acid form.
I mean, that sounds like a huge utilization improvement. That's like almost double the utilization. I mean, I'm going to do a quick research on this. So quick outtake, you might see it here. But let me just make sure. So to clarify, looking at the actual data, when comparing free acid versus the calcium salt of HMB, the two forms, so you're looking at 0.8 grams of free acid HMB versus 1 gram of calcium HMB. Ultimately, to confirm what he's saying is completely true. The data is pretty sound that it does increase the absorption, the utilization by about 91 to 97%. Whether or not that actually increases the efficacy is kind of unclear, but obviously greater bioavailability typically means better utilization and typically means better results. So if you're looking for the best form of HMB, probably the free acid form, as he pointed out here.
Is it something that's safe to take? Is it safe to take in relatively high amounts, right? Well, there's a study that was published in the journal Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. It looked at just this. It gave subjects 6 grams, which is a pretty hefty amount, and it monitored them for a month. They found at the end of that month, there were no changes in any of their biomarkers. Their cholesterol levels were fine, their lipid levels, everything was fine, okay? They didn't change anything, almost no change whatsoever, which indicates that it's pretty safe. And if you look at the meta-analysis that look at a lot of the cohort studies, look a lot at the various performance studies and everything like that, and try to extrapolate data to make sure it's safe, they find the same thing. No real safety concerns with HMB. There is one thing to be cognizant of though, and that's kind of the insulin response that may occur from it. The European Journal of Applied Physiology found that in rodents, if they gave them 320 milligrams of HMB per kilogram of body weight, which is a pretty hefty amount, they did have a pretty significant increase in their fasting insulin levels. Okay, this could imply that taking in HMB might have an effect on insulin sensitivity.
Okay. Before he continues on here, I do want to mention earlier you heard that like these hefty doses, right? Like 6 milligrams, and earlier I said the recommended daily dosage is 1 to 3 milligrams. Why would they use 6 milligrams? If you're familiar with scientific studies, this makes sense. For those that are unfamiliar, the reason why they do that is because they want to ensure that it's an obvious change. Obvious, like, you know, increase in whatever biomarker or decrease in whatever biomarker. Basically, they want to ensure that the data is, without a shadow of a doubt, correct, right? If you're using smaller doses, it's very hard to distinguish where exactly these benefits or detriments are actually coming from. If you use larger doses, it's way easier, right? So there are actually studies where, you know, they'll be giving people caffeine to determine what caffeine will actually do to them, and they'll be giving them doses of like 600 milligrams, sometimes even more, throughout the day, because they want to find out what exactly happens when you ingest caffeine. Obviously, those are extremes, and you shouldn't be ingesting those per day, but keep that in mind in the future when you see like supplements that are giving doses a little bit lower than what you've seen in clinical studies. Look up what the recommended dosage is and go based on that. Don't always go like a hefty dose unless it's proven safe.
Now, what does this mean? Insulin sensitivity is very important for muscle growth and for fat loss. Okay, it's also important just for general health, but being sensitive to insulin means that when you consume protein, when you consume carbohydrates, your body knows what to do with it and reacts to it quickly. Okay, so it's able to take what it needs and do its job with it. If you are resistant, you're not absorbing those nutrients as well. Here's the caveat though. Leucine by itself, its very nature, is insulinogenic. So leucine is going to trigger an insulin spike. possibly even more than HMB, but we don't know because the data is kind of conflicting. Protein, if you go and you eat a steak, you're going to have an insulin spike. Okay, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. So I'm not surprised to see that, and you're probably not going to be taking in that kind of dose, and especially if you're taking this in lieu of protein, right? Okay, and some of the data that I'm going to talk about combines HMB with whey protein, so we'll get into that in just a second because protein clearly matters. That's why we're focusing on this. And today's video sponsor, just for the record, is ButcherBox, which if you are interested in what kind of effect does it have. Okay, so there's an image that's popping up on the screen right now. If you look at this table, this is from the journal Nutrition, okay? This is cool because it gave subjects typical kind of HMB. They went through a routine with it. Now this was a 4-week routine, so if you're looking at the table, you can see that HMB supplementation, which is highlighted there, ended up resulting in more strength, ended up resulting in more muscle, and reduced fat levels, so less fat mass. When you look at that, it's pretty hard to say, like...
It's worth noting that if you see at the top here, this is over a 4-week period. So I would say, this does not mean that HMB necessarily has acute benefits, but certainly the data is very sound here that HMB does have positive impacts on resistance training results when ingested over a long period, which goes with what I was saying earlier, wherein if we take leucine like post-workout, we are going to see markers of like increased muscle mass, things like that. Pre-workout, we're actually going to see usually decreases in performance. And I'm not sure if HMB really tracks with that, but I would be curious to see the data on that. Though, given that HMB is a byproduct of breaking down leucine, I would argue that you should be wary at least of ingesting HMB prior to your working out.
I don't want to take this stuff. Like I would want to jump. I see that data and I want to jump into it, right? That's pretty, but when you're comparing it to placebo or comparing it to a control, you have to take a lot of things into consideration. So let's look at more data. HMB is just a metabolite of breaking down leucine. Okay, so let's look at a study that compares HMB to leucine, because that's the first thing that popped in my head before even reading into the research. Knowing what it is, I'm like, well, can leucine do the same thing? So this study took a look at 1.5 grams of HMB combined with whey protein, okay, or 1.5 grams of leucine combined with whey protein. Now, there's a lot of evidence in other studies that show that when you combine essential amino acids, such as leucine, to protein, you can up to 4x the bioavailability of protein. It does help the absorption and the utilization of protein. So this study took a look at all kinds of lifting, all kinds of things. And at the end of the day, there was no change across the board. No change in strength, no change in muscle, no change in fat loss. Leucine, essentially, when combined with whey protein, seemed to have the same effect as HMB for a lot less money, because leucine's pretty darn cheap. And this study was a good 12-week study with very structured resistance training protocols. Phase 1, they did standard sort of 3 times per week periodization. Then phase 2, they went into an overreaching phase where they trained for 5 times per week. You need to have that volume increase, okay? You need to have that periodization where you have overreaching or even a little bit of overtraining to stimulate muscle growth. And then the third phase was a deloading phase back to 3 times per week. So the study design was good as far as resistance training was concerned. So really gets me wondering, well, why wouldn't I just take leucine? So let's look at more data. And this is where it gets a little controversial because there's people that really say the results are so amazing with HMB. Are some of these studies like pulling some shenanigans or what's going on? Well, the European Journal of Applied Physiology published a paper taking a look at, again, a 12-week study in this case. And if you look at the table that's on the screen again right now, you're going to see, hey, once again, across all lifts, like deadlift, squat, bench press, significant improvements in the strength levels with HMB. Same kind of thing with muscle mass, same kind of thing with fat loss. It's the same thing over again. So this is one of the studies that's come into question because you're looking at, in this case, resistance-trained athletes. And when you're looking at already resistance-trained athletes, it's hard to get data from them because, first of all, their results are going to be across the board because they have different adaptations. That's why a lot of times you see studies looking at beginners, because with beginners, you know that if they start working out, they're going to all have a very similar response in terms of muscle trauma and everything like that. So a lot of,
Yeah, that's actually really important distinction there that he kind of outlines here. because there are actually a lot of studies that I've seen, even like recent studies, old studies, that use highly resistance trained individuals, and the results are relatively skewed because of that. So you'll sometimes get supplements that, for like one group of people, because they're new to working out, you're going to see huge results, right? Like, for example, taking L-citrulline, you see much greater results in muscle mass, much greater results in, power and strength output. Whereas if you look at highly resistance trained individuals, you see fractions of that, sometimes even insignificant results. And so I would say most people probably fall within the ballpark of very low training, or at least like mid training. Most people are not going to be in that like upper echelon of training. And so a lot of studies, I agree, should be focusing on like lower trained individuals, maybe mid-trained individuals, just to see exactly the impact that these supplements have, rather than, just if they actually work for somebody who's like maybe even reached their genetic potential, right? It just makes very little sense in my opinion.
BS has been called on these studies. They're saying like, okay, well, what else is going on? You can't look at this data. Are they supplementing with other things? We'll talk about that in a second, but there's two things that I paid attention to. One thing was the creatine kinase levels. Creatine kinase is something that is increased when you have muscle trauma. If I were to go and I were to lift a car right now and beat the heck out of my muscles and get really sore, I would probably have elevated levels of creatine kinase, indicating that I broke down a lot of muscle tissue and beating my body up. When you take a beginner and you put them in the gym, it doesn't take much for those creatine kinase levels to get elevated. For me, as a trained resistance athlete, to get the same levels of creatine kinase as someone that's never lifted before, I would have to lift pretty heavy. I'd have to push it pretty hard, right? Like a beginner is it's a lot easier for them to get sore and beat themselves up than it is for me, right? Well, the creatine kinase level...
Progressive overload, everyone.
Were matched in these studies that are under question, right? Showing that people that were resistance trained were pushing it really, really, really hard, okay, to end up getting the same result that a beginner would get. And so again, they're pushing it hard, so their results were good. Okay, they were taking HMB and that supported that. Again, we don't know if leucine would have done the same thing. Now, there was an interesting study that was done, and it was actually literally called Better Than Steroids, ? Because it was questioning how some of these HMB studies ended up suggesting that HMB could be stronger than some anabolics. Now, they're not saying that specifically, but when you put the data next to each other, you're like, okay, 600 milligrams of testosterone per week isn't getting as good of a result as taking in a few grams of HMB. I'm calling BS on that. And I can kind of see that, right? It's questionable. But again, these are shorter term results, so we don't know the full situation. Once again, exercise volume and exercise intensity would speak volumes here, no pun intended. Like, we need to know, how can you say someone is training XYZ intensity? It's very difficult. And Ryan Lowery, who is the author of one of the papers that was in question, I know him quite well, actually know him very well. And I mean, for what it's worth, I know he's an ethical person. And one of the papers that came into question that he had written was about HMB in conjunction with ATP. Okay, 400 milligrams of ATP. We all know that ATP is an energy currency. So if you're supplementing ATP, you're going to see increases in strength and possibly muscle mass and, strength leading to muscle mass.
So again, he's discussing long-term benefits. The studies that I've seen regarding ATP supplementation have been hovering around like 400 to 600 milligrams of ATP daily over like 12-ish weeks or so. I have not seen any acute benefits of ingesting ATP like just before a workout, 30 minutes to an hour before a workout. I have not seen any acute benefits there. So this is not, something that you maybe should be looking for in a pre-workout. This is something you should maybe be supplementing separately, kind of like beta-alanine. And if needed, you can also supplement creatine on top of it if it's not already in your pre-workout.
Mass and strength leading to more muscle mass leading to less body fat. Okay, the study was fairly transparent about the ATP utilization, the ATP supplementation, but some would argue, and I think Greg in the Better Than Steroids article was arguing that the ATP component wasn't talked about enough, and it's almost suggesting that HMB was giving all these effects. I didn't necessarily see that, but I see where that's coming from. The bottom line is that HMB does seem to be effective over placebo or over control. Is it something that you should be taking? I think it's pretty expensive. I don't think that it's getting results that are probably better than anabolics. I think that's highly unlikely. I think there's a lot of different confounders there. I think it's safe, but I think it's relatively expensive. And I think that if you could get the same effect with leucine, maybe you should start there, taking in some leucine. The one thing, and this is very important, the one thing that has me leaning slightly towards HMB, if I were to try it out, and again, it's kind of pricey, is the fact that HMB doesn't seem to spike insulin as high as leucine. So for someone like me who does a low carb protocol and doesn't want insulin spikes a lot and fast, I do intermittent fasting where I don't want to have insulin spikes, if HMB could be something that I could take to have sort of a downstream effect as if I was having leucine but without as big of an insulin spike, I'd be all over it. So that's the data I need to dig into more to see if it's something worthwhile for me. But I think the takeaway here is it's safe. I think it's good to try out. You might have an effect, you might not, but even if it's a placebo effect and you get something out of it, I think it's a win. So anyway, all kinds of new stuff popping up all the time, and I think there's a lot of other holes to be poked in other supplements outside of HMB, which has decent data. So that's my takeaway on it. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to be supplementing really anything, I think starting with leucine, as he pointed out, is a great place to start. Same thing with like creatine, for example. I would go as far as to say, for beginners, supplement creatine and leucine, and you're probably all set. Maybe have like 200 milligrams of caffeine via like maybe a pill or like a cup of coffee or something like that. I think you're pretty much set as a beginner. Then once you get like maybe like a year down the line, maybe 6 months down the line, you can start thinking about like supplementing like pre-workout supplements, L-citrulline, things like that. But I agree, like HMB, it sounds great. It sounds like it may be better than leucine. However, the data doesn't really exactly prove that. And so if we can guarantee relatively the same benefits with just leucine, I think that's a great idea. In fact, I think it's probably a fantastic idea for companies to start mixing leucine or HMB with protein powders. And in fact, I might be doing that myself because that sounds really, really smart. So as always, guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. And as always, stay strong and stay curious.